Oh, America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. 2012 to me encapsulated exactly what the Dallas Cowboys have represented to me for many years now. A team that at times looks like one of the five best teams in the NFL. Then the next week they'll turn around and look like one of the five worst teams in the NFL. Maddeningly inconsistent on offense and defense, all areas of the game. I don't get it with this team. I have ideas as to what the problem is, but the bottom line is, this is another season that the Cowboys probably should have made the playoffs and didn't. They finished 8-8, third place in the NFC East, and are holders of the 18th overall pick coming up in this April's NFL Draft. They went 3-3 in the NFC East, so when you only going at 500 in your own division, that's not very helpful to your playoff or divisional title chances. Throwing in there that they lost to the Washington Redskins twice, including the last week of the season. All you had to do was basically beat Washington one time this year, and the Cowboys would have won the division and made the playoffs. So, of course, they lost to them twice. Figures. Now we look at the Cowboys on the offensive side of the football. Tony Romo, from a standard, everyday standpoint, puts up some phenomenal numbers. 4,903 passing yards, 28 touchdowns. But you have to look a little deeper. 19 interceptions. Bad decisions at bad times. One thing I really didn't like about Tony Romo in 2012 is for some reason, I know he's been progressing to this more and more every year, but there were so many times this year, like the Baltimore game was a perfect personification to me of the Cowboys. You fall behind, then you make this great rally to come back, only to end up short because of a missed field goal. And you look at the Cowboys, you see Tony Romo, and he's making all of these freaking adjustments at the line and doing all this other bullshit. And it seemed like at times, even when Romo would be in rhythm, he would be doing things and taking too much time. He would take his offense out of rhythm. He would take himself out of rhythm. You're not Peyton Manning. You need to stop it, Romo, seriously. This shit's ridiculous. The one area you are just like Peyton Manning at is your failure to consistently perform well in big games, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But to be fair to Tony Romo, he is a great regular season quarterback in a lot of ways, puts up some big numbers. At times, the offense of Jason Garrett and the Dallas Cowboys puts too much burden and too much pressure on Tony Romo. The fact that he has to throw for 4,900 yards, and they rank 31st in the league as a team in rushing yards, means that they lack balance on offense, and that's not news to any Cowboys fan. Whether it's DeMarco Murray being hurt or Felix Jones being hurt, it's always something. So too much of the game ends up resting in Tony Romo's hands. Des Bryant had his best year as a pro. He had over 1,300 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns. Jason Witten had a 1,000-yard receiving season. They have weapons on that Cowboys offense. And when you look at this team offensively, you look at them and say, my God, this should be a great offense. And they have moments where they play just like that, like they're a great offense. And then they have other moments you can't figure out what the hell is going on. You're like, why does this team suck? Like, look at week 1 and week 2. Week 1, they owned the Giants, basically. The score may not reflect it, but they basically owned the Giants. And then they come back at week 2 and get the shit kicked out of them by the Seattle Seahawks. What, 27-7? That's the Cowboys in a nutshell. And I'm sorry, Cowboy fans. You could say that the running game should be better, and you're right, it should be. You could say that the offensive line protecting Tony Romo should be better, and it should be. And you could say at times that he was betrayed by his receivers running bad routes or dropping balls, and again, you are absolutely correct. All of those things help contribute to the problem. But for the love of humanity, at some point in time after time after time after time, Tony Romo fails to deliver in a big-time situation or in a big game. Look at what he did in Washington. Do I need to? Cowboy fans, I know some of you get it, but some of you still stubbornly don't. Romo is like a football version, if you will, of Kevin Garnett when he was with the Minnesota Timberwolves. A very, very good player, in Garnett's case, a great player, that really filled up the stat sheet. But when the game was on the line, consistently demonstrated that he lacked the clutch gene. And when it got to the playoffs, he didn't play very well there. Well, that's the same thing with Tony Romo. He puts up great numbers that kind of suck you in and fool you, but then he has that 3 or 4 pick game in a spot where his team really needs him to play well, and he lays an absolute goose egg out there, and he does it time after time after time after time. And this guy is not a young chicken anymore. We're talking about a guy who's getting close to his mid-30s. At some point in time, the Cowboys organization is going to have to realize that maybe Tony Romo, once and for all, is not the man. He's the quarterback that gets you to a certain level, yes, but you're never going to get to that next level. And I ask Cowboy fans this. If Romo was truly the guy, then why does the team really, in all aspects, represent the leader, Tony Romo? They're maddeningly inconsistent. One week they look like one of the best in the world, and then the next week they look like one of the worst in the world. It's because they're a reflection of their quarterback, Tony Romo. And it absolutely blows my mind and defies any and all logic why they continue to make excuses for him and why Jerry Jones refuses to try and find somebody else to potentially replace him. He's not the guy. He's a good but not great quarterback. He still threw 19 interceptions last year. Made some other incredibly boneheaded, head-scratching decisions. He's not getting any younger. Don't let your organization go down with your aging quarterback. And then defensively, the Cowboys weren't very good, which is kind of sad for them after they invested big money in Brandon Carr and traded up big in the first round to go get Morris Claiborne. They finished tied for 20th in sacks, 24th in points allowed, had only 16 takeaways on defense, and Morris Claiborne, I thought, quite frankly, was shaky at times as a rookie for certain. And Rob Ryan, the defensive coordinator, instead of the head coach Jason Garrett going with him, Garrett stays, the defensive coordinator Rob Ryan goes, and in comes Monty Kiffin. And after years of running the 3-4 in Dallas, they're now going to switch to a 4-3 cover 2 scheme. That is going to be an interesting subplot and storyline that's going to play out throughout this offseason, through the NFL draft, and into training camp next year. It really is. Now, when I look at the Cowboys, I try to figure out, why exactly they're in the position that they're in. A maddeningly inconsistent, mediocre football team. And that's exactly what they are. And the first and most obvious thing that stands out is Jerry Jones. This team hasn't won a Super Bowl for all the bullshit we get about them being America's team and all the times that the major networks make sure that they feature the Dallas Cowboys no matter what. This is a team that hasn't won a Super Bowl since the 1995 season. It hasn't exactly had a hot streak of making a lot of playoff appearances in the meantime. Well, what's the one constant in all that? It's the owner that won't get the hell out of the way and let football people run the football side of operations on their own, and that's Jerry Jones. And until he swallows his pride, realizes that he is a moron, that should not be running the draft room or anything else, the Cowboys are going to continue to be the same type of team. Period. Year after year after year, excuses are made for this team. Year after year after year, they perform in the same similar manner. Year after year after year, they come up short. And when you look at the NFL draft, you could tell that Jerry Jones is running this crap. You look at Dez Bryant. He's the best of the first-round picks over the past 5 years. But even with Dez Bryant, this is a guy that's had some off-the-field issues in the past. This is a guy that sometimes his head doesn't seem to be in the game or his heart doesn't seem to be in the game. If he's right, he's as good as anybody in the entire NFL at his position. But he also has other times where he runs terrible routes or makes, dumb plays, or he drops easy catches in big spots. He is the perfect representation of a guy that's incredibly talented and incredibly frustrating to watch all at the same time. I mean, he had, 1,300 yards and double-digit touchdowns this year, and I felt like all the times I saw Dez Bryant this year that he could have done so much more. The only thing that stops Dez Bryant from being a top 3 or top 5 receiver in the NFL is not opposing defenses, is not Tony Romo, it's freaking Dez Bryant. Their 2009 draft class was a total loss. Over the past 5 years, they've only devoted 2 picks to the offensive line in the first 3 rounds, and that's when guys like Gerard on the interior and Flozell Adams and Mark Colombo got old and they got pushed out the door. That's why they struggled in the running game, and that's why they've struggled to protect Tony Romo at times, is because they didn't invest enough in the depth on the offensive line. They didn't have young studs in place to replace the guys that were leaving. That's why they had to spend a first-round pick on Smith last year. That's why potentially offensive line is another place they're going to invest this year in the offseason and in the draft. You have guys with this switch to the cover 2. I'm going to be very curious to see how they adapt to this cover 2 switch, playing Ware at defensive end, potentially Anthony Spencer at defensive end. But a couple of guys that they drafted in their linebacking core, I think, could potentially benefit huge from a switch to a 3-4. Bruce Carter, I think, could be a Pro Bowler as a 4-3 cover 2 weak side linebacker. Sean Lee, I think, could be a very effective middle linebacker in a cover 2 scheme. They have some pieces in place that could potentially fit that cover two defense. There might not be as much of a transition or a struggle as some may anticipate. But you look at other first round picks they've had, like Mike Jenkins and Felix Jones, guys that, again, very talented. But for whatever reason, whether it's injuries or whether it's just lack of mental focus or not having their heart in or head in the game, they just frustrate the piss out of you when you watch the team because you know they could do so much more, and they just don't. And when you look at the Cowboys over the past several years, that's exactly what they've been. And it's a reflection of what they've drafted over the past several years because those have been primarily the type of players that they have drafted. In terms of the offseason or draft philosophy for the Cowboys coming up, I look at them, I don't know if they're going to be big players in the free agent market. They could be, but I think it's more important to look forward to the draft for that organization. And when you look at this team, they obviously felt, or at least Jerry Jones did, that a change needed to be made, a switch needed to happen on the defense, and he was tired of the 3-4, he was tired of Rob Ryan, hence why Monty Kiffin was brought in. I think that was the first phase of getting a transition going to the Lovie Smith era in Dallas, but I'll talk about that in a second. But knowing Monty Kiffin and knowing his history going back to Tampa Bay, when you look at the players that he built that Tampa defense around, it was built around Warren Sapp at defensive tackle. Eventually, Simeon Rice as the one, really athletic edge rusher at defensive end. Derek Brooks as the weak side linebacker, and then John Lynch was your stud safety with Rondé Barber as your cornerback that really, really fit that cover two scheme. And when I look at this team, I see the corners with Claiborne and Carr, and I see two guys that I think really do fit that cover two defensive scheme very nicely. I think you'll see some improvement out of Morris Claiborne next year, and you'll see Brandon Carr, I think, in some ways be right at home in that scheme. At the safety position, I really don't think they have much there. Linebacker, like I said, I really think Lee can play middle linebacker in a 4-3, and I sure as hell know that Bruce Carter could be a potential stud as a weak side linebacker in a cover two scheme. You look at the end position, if they re-sign Anthony Spencer, who's a free agent, and you've got DeMarcus Ware on the other side, you could potentially have a couple of very good cover two defensive ends. But in terms of the tackle position, I don't know necessarily if they really have anybody that truly fits the cover two scheme at the defensive tackle position. So when I look at this team's philosophy heading into the first round of the draft, I would be surprised if it wasn't, it's going to be geared towards defense. Whether that be finding a defensive tackle like Sheldon Richardson or Kawan Short or Jesse Williams. Maybe they like one of the pass rushers in this draft, like Deion Jordan from Oregon or Barkevius Mingo from LSU. Smaller guys for defensive ends, but they fit perfectly in that Monty Kiffin attacking cover two scheme. Maybe they would look at a safety like Kenny Vaccaro from Texas or Eric Reed from LSU or what have you. The bottom line is with this switch to the cover two scheme on defense, they have some pieces in place that will transition to that scheme, I believe, very, very nicely. But knowing Monty Kiffin's history of the type of players that he succeeded with, I think he's going to be looking for guys that fit somewhat into that mold. He has his weak side linebacker, I believe, but he doesn't have that defensive tackle, and I don't think he has that stud safety. So I would not be surprised in the first two rounds of this draft to see the Dallas Cowboys address defensive tackle and safety. They could address defensive end in the first round if they think one of these 240, 250-pound edge rushers is just too good to pass up. That very well could be the case. Offensively, I don't know how much they're going to really address this side of the ball, even though I think it does need some addressing. The interior of the offensive line is not that great. You could argue that Doug Free at right tackle is not that great. You could also say that they need to address the running game, and that would be a very legitimate concern. But maybe it's one of those situations where they address that maybe in the third or fourth or fifth round and add some more depth to their backfield. Felix Jones, I believe, is a free agent, and he might not be back. DeMarco Murray is a guy that he has a ton of talent, but he's got to stay healthy. Maybe if you get a big bowling ball back as a compliment to him, something like you used to have with the Marion Barber back a few years ago, you'd be able to keep DeMarco Murray a little fresher, a little healthier, and you'd have a nice 1-2 combination. And you'd also be able to take some pressure off of Tony Romo. That way he hasn't having to throw for 4,900 yards for this team to move the ball and to be able to win games. And you wouldn't have to always rely on him to make the big play or make the right decision in the clutch situation. Take the ball out of his hands as much as possible when the game matters the most, and you might have a shot if you're the Dallas Cowboys. But when I look at this team in 2013, I'm sorry, Cowboy fans, until proven otherwise, this is a overrated football team. They have all types of talent all over the place, and it just doesn't piece together right. One week they're one of the best teams in the league. One week they're one of the worst teams in the league. They are mediocre, inconsistent. I would be surprised even if they addressed some needs on defense to fit Monty Kiffin's cover 2 scheme, that they would be anything more than 7-9, 8-8, 9-7. And I think that's what this year is going to ultimately be about, is going to be about getting Jason Garrett the hell out of there and transitioning to a new era, the Lovie Smith era in Dallas, if you will.